and ever worsening housing and homelessness crisis and the crisis in our health service. And we are going to be again seeking to raise those issues this week as we head towards that election. First of all, the health service. For weeks now, people before Profit and Solidarity have been raising the fact that the government have deceived the public about a recruitment embargo being imposed on the health service, preventing the recruitment of desperately needed health workers to address the overcrowding in our hospitals, the long waiting lists, and the huge gaps in community health care, in child and disability network teams. At every level of the health service, there is a chronic situation of understaffing and under-resourcing. And this new embargo, under the name of the pay and number strategy, which we've highlighted, I think, every week for probably the last 5 weeks in the Dáil, the government are failing to acknowledge the dire impact this is having on the safe staffing levels in the hospital, on patient care, and an increasingly demoralised workforce in the health service. When we raised this a number of weeks ago in my area, we highlighted, because we were first tipped off about this by health workers in St Michael's Hospital and Loughlinstown Hospital and St Luke's Hospital. Interestingly, when we did raise it and held meetings in our area, I all of a sudden got a letter from the HSE saying that St Michael's were going to authorise 21 new posts to fill the staffing gaps in St Michael's. Talking to the workers, not a single one of those posts has appeared. So there is a deception going on where the government claims they're trying to recruit people to fill the gaps and address the crisis in our health service, but in actuality they are continuing to impose these staff quotas and staff ceilings, preventing the actual recruitment of people that are needed to ensure proper patient safety and proper patient care. So we will again be urging the government to end this recruitment embargo and ensure that we have safe staffing levels, and indeed that they forward the legislation, the patient safety licensing legislation, which was promised years ago but which they have failed to bring forward. Also, we want to highlight, which the Simon report today has done, again showing the complete failure of the government to address the rental crisis, which is driving people into homelessness and getting ever worse, where the people who are approved for HAP and are told to go out and look for places that simply don't exist. So 12 out of 16 of the areas, nothing available whatsoever within the HAP limits or even the homeless HAP limits. So when you're facing the prospect of homelessness, you're given a certain limit to find a rental property, and no such properties exist in the vast majority of the country. And it really highlights the abysmal failure of the government to control rents. We have long called for the imposition of proper rent controls to set rents at affordable levels. And in the absence of that, even to give some increases in HAP, it's not the ideal solution, but to at least give approve people for HAP thresholds that allow them some prospect of being able to find a property that they can afford. But really what is needed are real rent controls, which is something that exists in most of the rest of Europe, where you set rents at actually affordable levels. But this government's failure to do that just proves that they are dancing to the tune of corporate landlords and people profiteering from the housing crisis. That's who they represent, and we hope and believe that as we head towards an election, the anger people feel about their failure to control rents and stop the profiteering that is at the heart of the housing and homelessness crisis in this country will be an absolutely central issue of the forthcoming election.
Thanks. A number of quick points. First thing is that obviously the world is watching as the horror continues to unfold, continues to deepen in Gaza and in Lebanon. And unfortunately, the government's extremely cynical game of talking out of two sides of their mouth, or talking out of one side and acting out of another, continues. We hear this morning that while last week, under big pressure from below, the government was saying, OK, we can find a way to progress the Occupied Territories Bill, which, let's remember, was introduced in 2018, is an extremely limited measure, limited only to those illegal settlements under international law. But then this week we hear that, oh no, there won't be enough time to progress it before the election. So really extremely cynical, where they want to go into the election having given a vague promise of doing something, taking some action against the horror that is being perpetrated by Israel, but actually not doing anything to make it happen. That is the height of cynicism. We will be saying to the government, if you're serious about the Occupied Territories Bill, well then let us progress it. If we need to sit next week, let's sit next week. Let's get it progressed. Let's get it passed into law. This has been sitting around now for 6 years in the Dáil. No more delays are acceptable. And, you know, any attempt to say that, oh, don't worry, we'll do it after the election, should simply not be believed by people. It's quite transparent and quite disgusting cynicism given the genocide that is unfolding. Second point I want to make is in relation to the sneaky cut, which is introduced in the social welfare bill. It's reported in the Irish Independent. The Irish Independent reports that it went unnoticed last week. It didn't go unnoticed. We spoke about it in the Dáil. We opposed it in the Dáil. I think we were probably the only party to do it. But effectively they have more than doubled the so-called penalty impact, the reduction in job seekers' allowance for people who are deemed not to be engaging with so-called employment services. We should remember that these employment services are outsourced to private corporations like CTEC, like Turris Nua, and that effectively the government is following the Tory line here. This is a cruel cut from Heather Humphreys following the Tories. It's exactly what was implemented by the Tories in Britain. And the impact will not be to get more people back at work. There will be reasons that people are not at work, for example, severe mental health issues, that it will just drive people further into poverty, further into misery. And what I particularly highlighted last week is the impact that this has on children. The children are not responsible. Whatever you think about people who are long-term on social welfare, who haven't engaged for whatever reason, their children are not to blame in any sense, and the children are going to be punished. 1 in 7 children in this country are growing up in poverty. That number is going to increase with this performative cruelty from the government, which is about being hard on, so-called social welfare cheats without regard for the consequences. You're asking people to live on 154 euros a week, and then pro rata in terms of having then a certain increase for children and so on. It's an extremely cruel cut in the dying days of the government. In contrast to that, today we will be asked to vote through almost 100 million euros for the horse and greyhound racing industry. This is the 11th budget that I have been in the Dáil for. Over the time of these 11 budgets, almost €1 billion will have been given to the horse and greyhound racing industry. We had a bizarre comment from a Minister of State, I think it was Thomas Byrne, last week saying, oh no, don't worry, the reason we're giving the money to greyhound racing is that it isn't really a sport. But the whole basis of this is that supposedly it's a sport. But what they want to avoid the comparison is the reality. While they throw money at the horse and greyhound racing industry, they give a fraction of that to all of the actual sports in this country. So 100 million euros to horse and greyhound racing, about 20 million euros to all other sports combined. GAA, FAI, Swim Ireland, Olympics are all, but between all of them, they get about 20 million euros a year, and yet 100 million annually is now being given to greyhound racing. I highlighted in the last couple of months that the deaths of greyhounds at greyhound racing tracks increased by 60% in the first half of this year. There's no evidence that the animal welfare issues are being addressed. Ireland is one of only 7 countries where greyhound racing remains legal, and we know in terms of the portion of the money that goes to horse racing, from previous information, we know that the vast majority of that ends up tax-free in the pockets of some of the richest people in this country. That's what that money goes for. So the idea that we're going to continue to shovel 100 million euros a year is an absolute scandal. Final quick point I'll make, just in terms of election date. I do think it is quite illustrative of the thinking of the government that they still won't give us a date, that they continue to play this game even though they have a date themselves. And the reason for it, and they're kind of open about it, is they don't want to have a long election campaign. If they said November 29th now, well then we're into a 5.5 week election campaign. What are they so scared of? Why don't they want to have a long election campaign where people can debate what sort of government we can have? And what they're scared of is momentum developing behind the idea that we don't want Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael back in again. We want a significant and a left alternative in terms of what we are putting forward. And I think the government should just give us the date that they clearly have agreed between themselves at this point in time, instead of continuing to play some of these games.
So I'd like to make a few points about what's coming back on the doors, and I'd also like to make a few points about the latest twist in the Cork Event Centre saga. So, like all other parties, we've been out on the doors in the last weeks and in the last days, and it's interesting. One thing that I can say with a degree of certainty is I don't think the government are going to get the bounce that they would like to get from the budget. It's quite common for people to say that that was an attempt to give one for everybody in the audience and to bribe the electorate. I also think that the anti-government feeling is a bit stronger than the polls would suggest. We'll see how that plays out. Knocking on doors a year ago, the anti-government vote tended to go mainly towards one party. That has changed, I think. I think the anti-government vote is far more of an open question as to where it's going to go now. And, you know, not solely for that reason, but it is an important point to register. People Before Profit Solidarity will be standing in more than 40 constituencies in this election. And we would remind people about the track record. The party in the Dáil that helped to spearhead the anti-water charges campaign, the group in the Dáil that were to the fore of the campaign for repeal, and now in this Dáil, the party that I think is most closely associated with, and certainly whose politics are most in tune with, the Palestine movement on the streets, which has brought more than 100,000 people out onto the streets in this country over the last year. One of the questions that I get asked on the door is, are you independent? And the answer that I give is, well, we're independent of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. We're not going to be going into any coalition with them. We're independent of the big business interests who see themselves being represented in politics by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. But we are part of the socialist left, and we want a strong socialist left bloc in the next Dáil. We have 5 TDs in the current Dáil. I don't think it's unrealistic to say that we could come back with double that, given some of the feedback that we've been getting in recent days and weeks. So, on the issue of the Cork Event Centre, I mean, it was during the general election of 2016 that then Taoiseach Enda Kenny turned the sod, a famous photograph, certainly in Cork. Every household would be well aware of that photograph. And now we hear that the party leaders and the coalition have decided to go for re-tendering, pushing the project back well past general election 24, nearly 9 years after the turning of the sod, and not one brick laid on that site. For the people of Cork, that's a huge disappointment, and for the Fine Gael party, it's a huge embarrassment. A huge embarrassment, there's no question about that. You also see how they're prepared to squander public funds. At the council meeting where this first arose, I said this should be a state project. built on a not-for-profit basis. They said, no, we'll put 20 million into it. That's ballooned to 57 million, and if reports are to be believed, they're talking about adding another 30 to 40 million, possibly bringing the state investment over 100 million for a project which would be owned by private enterprise. I think the situation with social and affordable housing in this country is the best argument for why we need a state construction company to build for profit, not for profit, but for the needs of society. But the Cork Event Centre is a definite point in that argument as well, and we'll be raising that issue this week too. Thank you.
Paul, can I ask you about the waiting list for children for spinal surgeries? The Minister told the Cabinet today that the number of children waiting longer than 4 months has gone from north of 80 down to 20, and he aims to get it to 0 at some point next year, and that anyone waiting more than 4 months will be offered a surgery abroad. Do you think that's an appropriate move?
Well, I think, again, it's a little bit like the Occupied Territories Bill, in a sense that we're hearing promises now that are going to happen and be implemented after the election. And I think, given the track record of this government, they're not promises that can be believed. I think almost everybody in the country will have seen the infamous interview with Simon Harris, I think it was with Claire Byrne, where as Minister for Health, he promised that all these kids would be seen years and years ago, and they still haven't. There's obviously a significant issue in terms of sending these children abroad, where in many cases they're simply not able to go abroad to get treatment. I know many of the parents are not convinced by these promises, so we'll continue to be pressing it in the Dáil this week.
Okay.
Are you taking issue with Taoiseach Feinn's sort of his gift to call the election date? In reality, though, is it not his decision?
Well, he's wrong constitutionally. Constitutionally, it's his gift to dissolve the Dáil, but it is the Minister for Housing who does the writ in terms of when the election date is, within a specified amount of time. So he is wrong. He keeps repeating this point about how it's his constitutional prerogative. It is actually not his constitutional prerogative. But the key point is that these games of him insisting that it's his right versus the others, I just don't think it's an appropriate way to treat this democratic process and the rights of the public in this. Is that, like, surely the public are better armed. I believe that the three party leaders know when the election is going to be now, and I don't understand why they can't tell the public. And I think it's like clearly to try to in some way shortchange, limit the amount of time for campaigning. But like, that's not appropriate. If they know the election time, they can work out there. Let us just know the election time. Doesn't mean the Dáil is dissolved. Obviously the Dáil is clearly going to come back after next week. That's fine. But just tell us what the election date is so the public can prepare and can begin to tune in. You know, it does say something. They don't want people to tune into the election. They want the election period to be as short as possible. They don't want people to think about the consequences of their votes. And we and the opposition are the ones saying, well, we want people to think about the consequences of their votes.
Do you not? You hardly want a 6-week campaign, though.
Yeah, well, I think they're going to call the election. I mean, there is a 6-week campaign. We've been running a 7-week campaign in Dublin South West. We started canvassing 7 weeks from what is going to be the date. Every night we're going to continue going. So, like, that's the reality. But then, like, let the public in on the secret. They're running more than a 6-week campaign in reality. And for all Micheál Martin's talk about governing rather than campaigning, he's been running an 8-9 week campaign. So just tell the public the date. I presume it's going to be November 29th, and let everybody plan accordingly.
Just briefly on that. I was listening to Mary Regan on RTE, and I think she made a sharp point. She said that long election campaigns tend not to suit governments. And what you have now is you've got a long election campaign. There'll be 3 weeks of an unofficial campaign plus 3 weeks of an official campaign. All the parties are on the door now, and after yesterday, people will be producing their vote number 1 leaflets. Okay, the posters can't go up for a couple of weeks yet, but it's on. And I think Mary Regan might well be right there. I think a 6-week run-in may not suit the government because it allows for more debate and discussion, and it allows for more things to be put under the spotlight, like the National Children's Hospital, like the housing crisis, like the situation of young people being forced to emigrate because they can't afford to rent, can't afford to buy, and don't have the prospect. So it's game on, we're out there, and we think the initial feedback is quite interesting.
Just on the Occupied Territories Bill, yourselves and Labour both said you'd be in favour of sitting next week to allow it fight, or is it actually feasible that it could be progressed next week and the week after and still have an election before Christmas?
I mean, the bill exists. It's been sitting, it's been examined, it's been discussed since 2018. They are saying now they have advice from the Attorney General which says they need to amend it. Okay, fine. Then they have the work done. It can be done. I mean, the finance bill clearly is going to be done. We did second stage, last week. It's clear that we're going to end up doing all remaining committee and all remaining stages next week, in 1 week. If a bill as long and as complicated as the finance bill can effectively be done in a week, I mean, that all could literally be done in a week. We did a social welfare bill in 1 week. The Occupied Territories bill, which has been sitting around since 2018, can absolutely be processed within a week if the government is committed to doing it.
And can I just mention on this as well, another major demand that people are articulating who have been out in the streets in solidarity with the horror that the Palestinians are enduring at the hands of Israel, is that the government should act immediately to stop the facilitation of the sale of Israeli war bonds, which Ireland has now become, according to Gabriel Makhlouf, when he came to the Finance Committee, which I'm a member of. He shocked me, and I'm not easily shocked about these things, by telling us that Ireland is the main hub for selling Israeli war bonds across Europe, where they're being actively and explicitly branded as funding Israel's war effort in Gaza. It's absolutely shocking that Ireland is the major hub for the sale of these bonds to finance the genocide in Gaza, now the attacks on Lebanon, and the government have done nothing about it. And Gabriel Makhlouf made clear that it was the government who had to take action on this, that the financial rules of the European Union, they said, required them to approve, as long as they ticked certain boxes, to approve the facilitating the sale of these bonds, which, by the way, tells you something about the amorality of European financial rules, that genocide isn't a sufficient reason to prohibit the sale of bonds that are funding these crimes against humanity. But it is absolutely shameful that the government hasn't intervened and acted to stop the facilitation of the sale of those bonds that are financing the mass murder of Palestinians. And we will be articulating that demand this week in the Dáil as well.